Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
On August 9, 1974, Richard Milhous Nixon became the first American president to resign from office. Nixon was loved by many and hated by many, but Americans who assess Richard Nixon's legacy only through his resignation fail to recognize the controversial politician's entire political contribution. This is a brief history. In January 1969, Richard Nixon took the oath of office as the 37th President of the United States. By this time, he had already celebrated an improbable political career. Nixon grew up in a financially modest family in Yorba Linda, California. But with the benefit of a persistent work ethic and excellent debate skills, Nixon climbed the political ranks at a meteoric speed, first being elected to the House of Representatives in 1946 and then to the U.S. Senate in 1950. Then, a mere 2 years after his election to the Senate, Nixon became vice president when he was elected with General Dwight D. Eisenhower in November 1952. However, Nixon did not win every election. In 1960, Senator John F. Kennedy edged out Vice President Nixon in one of the closest presidential races in American history. After Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, announced he would not seek re-election in 1968, Nixon re-entered the political scene and was elected president in November 1968, defeating Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace in a three-party race. President Nixon made clear that his initial attention would be directed at improving the United States' relations with other countries and to bring an honorable end to the war in Vietnam. According to an interview with former United States Ambassador Tibor Nagy, President Nixon's early focus on foreign relations was unusual at the time.
Well, Nixon was one of the few presidents for whom priority was international relations and not domestic policy. It was very interesting because for most U.S. presidents, issue number one is domestic politics. And only at the end of their term do they really start, unless forced to, but at the end of their term they treat, okay, what can we do to be remembered by history at the world at large? But Nixon, from day one, and I think part of this was his background and then having been vice president, really recognized that foreign policy was the most important component for the presidency.
In an attempt to place pressure on the Soviet Union, which had effectively blocked discussions over hostilities in Vietnam, Nixon and Kissinger devised a strategy now called triangular diplomacy. Rather than dealing with the Soviets directly, Nixon announced an invitation to visit and improve relations with China, a rival of the USSR. Feeling threatened that a U.S.-Sino relationship would leave the Soviets exposed, leaders of the USSR quickly invited Nixon to visit Russia as well. During this trip, the United States and Soviet Union signed a number of significant agreements, including a limit on intercontinental ballistic missiles, a trade deal, and ultimately on a relationship that would later permit a ceasefire in the war in Vietnam. Dr. Robert English, who is the chairman of the International Relations Department at the University of Southern California, discusses how President Nixon's achievements in foreign policy are among the best in U.S. history.
I think 50 years from now, Richard Nixon's reputation as a foreign policy president won't be very different from what it is today. And today already it's pretty strong. In the immediate aftermath of Watergate, domestic scandals, of course, all kinds of tape recordings that were released, when the shock of a lot of that had passed and historians, already in the 80s and 90s began thinking about his foreign policy legacy and his foreign policy performance, they were already coming around to a consensus that he was pretty good, one of our better foreign policy presidents. I think if you ask about 50 years from now, even 25, he would be one of our, top 5, maybe even top 3 foreign policy presidents.
As part of his domestic agenda, the Nixon administration worked to create what is now known as the Environmental Protection Agency. President Nixon also signed into law educational amendments called Title IX to provide more equality for young women and encouraged the desegregation of schools consistent with the Supreme Court's 1954 decision in Brown v. Board of Education. Had Richard Nixon's presidential term ended with these accomplishments, his leadership and legacy would be easy to define. However, the 37th president will also be remembered for the damage his administration's dishonesty and secrecy caused, which led to his own downfall. In 1971, the New York Times and others published portions of a history of Vietnam War strategy dubbed the Pentagon Papers, which had been leaked from RAND employee Daniel Ellsberg. Even though the study never involved the Nixon administration, President Nixon authorized a secret group called the Plumbers to stop further leaks. The Plumbers broke into the office of the psychiatrist in an attempt to find information that would hurt Ellsberg. In 1972, some of the Plumbers, at the direction of officials who worked at the White House, broke into the office of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate complex to install recording devices on the telephones and take documents. On a second break-in in June 1972, they were arrested. There is no direct proof linking President Nixon to the planning of the Watergate break-in, but evidence suggests that Nixon attempted to obstruct the criminal investigation. In June 1972, President Nixon approved plans proposed by Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman to attempt to discourage the FBI from investigating into the break-in. This conversation and others were recorded onto the White House's internal recording system. The Watergate scandal had no real effect on the outcome of the presidential race, because in November 1972, President Nixon was re-elected in one of the largest landslides in U.S. history. However, public concern about Watergate continued to grow. In the spring of 1973, a Senate committee held public hearings, and Archibald Cox was appointed special investigator by the Department of Justice. When testimony revealed the existence of the tape recording system in the White House, both the Senate committee and Cox subpoenaed the recordings. President Nixon refused to turn them over, claiming executive privilege. Nixon later fired Cox and attempted to eliminate the role of special prosecutor altogether. Alvin Felsenberg, who teaches political communications at the University of Pennsylvania and is the former spokesman for the 9/11 Commission, comments that President Nixon's Watergate problem was self-inflicted.
Nixon had a great deal of insecurities, and I think that he did not have, sadly, the ability to take the American people who had just returned him to office and say, you know, while I was in China, while I was trying to end the war and bring your boys home, a lot of things happened in this store that I just found out about, and I didn't really like what was going on. And here's what I've done about it. And I'm appointing a special prosecutor to get it out of here so I can get on with the reasons you made me president. That's how he could have started a second term. Instead, everything became a tooth extraction.
The legal battle over the White House recordings reached a constitutional boiling point through the summer of 1974, when on July 24th, the United States Supreme Court, by an 8-0 decision, ordered President Nixon to turn over the White House recordings. Facing an adverse Supreme Court decision and the passage of articles of impeachment by the House Judiciary Committee, Richard Nixon decided that a public trial in the Senate would not be in the nation's interest. So, on August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon announced he was resigning the presidency the next day. He was replaced by Vice President Gerald Ford, who pardoned Nixon from all charges related to the Watergate case. Despite his legacy of leadership in foreign policy and domestic programs, the events that led to Richard M. Nixon's resignation will not be easily forgotten. These experiences, too, provide an important lesson that no man is above the law and that our ongoing democracy depends on honesty and a concern for the well-being of the nation.